A warm welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom, and you're watching youtube.com/getnuanced. And in this video today, I wanted to talk about something that I've been very surprised with, at least on YouTube, the overall lack of coverage when it comes to English-speaking analysis that is supposed to be more, I think, directed, if you're like me, from someone domestically, as this is an issue that regards foreign policy. And I think despite the clear mediocrity domestically, which you're seeing in American politics, which I think the 2020 election and the options of Biden and Trump just underscore that mediocrity, which is just very apparent to anyone who's even halfway paying attention. I think a lot of people with the recent events that are just as important but domestic are very easily able to overlook and maybe not even be aware of the events that are also being shaped abroad when it comes to the United States' political system, and in particular our foreign policy, which is something that is not really as much interested in when it comes to the culture war and also the, outrage hysteria, all the different things that incentivize people to tune into certain content. I think it's a lot more easy for more people to grasp abstract cultural ideas, where it's very easy to give a one way or another look at something, which might even be more nuanced than what many think about it, regardless of where they stand politically, but is very much the kind of clickbaity content that people who are clout chasers or, grifters, when it comes to the YouTube community, there's a bunch in every sort of category, which it's very clear that they're not really passionate about the content they're producing. They're doing it because they know it makes them money and it's lucrative. And I think that mentality is something that's all too often seen in our politics as well when it comes to the political class in the Democrat and Republican Party. And I think that when it comes to understanding when it comes to our system and why there's so many different failures, is that foreign policy is something that heavily plays into that. And beyond just the police budget, which I think should definitely be adjusted. And I think obviously we need to increase education, provide, I think, universal health care, and also at the same time, just do things that would make a society more about the actual people and not just the private domestic and foreign interest of the very well connected that can afford to lobby or have their special interest groups be able to influence how policy is crafted in Washington. And these different groups are able to basically influence the legislature, the executive office with the president themselves, regardless of who's in office, and also obviously subsequently the judicial system, as the people from the executive and legislature determine who the judges are as well, and they have their own biases, just like any person, publication, or politician. And I think that when it comes to these issues, it's very easy to watch on mainstream media a couple of minute-long soundbite that either omits or obfuscates or conveniently leaves out tidbits of very crucial information, which would definitely change one's opinion on the matter, which is more or less just a kind of propaganda narrative, more than it's just a way to inform someone about what's going on in the world, so we can have actually a sincere and reality-driven perspective on an issue. And I think that we should be empathetic towards those abroad, and as much as those who are with us domestically within the United States itself. And I think that when it comes to karma, I think everyone can agree on a personal level, what goes around comes around. And I think that we're seeing right now in some manifestations of U.S. foreign policy some what I believe is truly malevolent activity. And that is a perfect segue into why I will be talking about and be reading an article from War on the Rocks, which I'll include in the video description below, along with going over a little bit of the H.R. 31 bill that the 116th Congress in its first session originally drafted. And as of June 13th, 2020, which is the day I'm filming this, and I think more so a few days ago, but now, as of right now and going forward, we're in the middle of getting the Syrian, let's see what the name of this is actually, yes, the Syrian Civilian Protection Act of 2019, as it was drafted then, and now it's 2020, and you see under it 2019 and 2020. So I really want to go over what this is, and I mean Caesar is a callback to Julius Caesar, who was the Roman dictator that, when he was assassinated during the Ides of March, was replaced by his nephew, and who got his adopted name of Gaius Octavius Julius Caesar, and then later became Augustus after he became sole ruler of the Roman Republic and transitioned it into the empire under the early Principate period, which would last for over a millennia afterwards in different forms. But Julius Caesar was pretty much the inaugurator of the end of the Republic as it functioned during its traditional era. And you could argue that the Republic itself had been morphing into more of an imperialistic state throughout its existence, and that by that point, during the 1st century BC, that it was already on a trajectory that just needed someone to be that variable that was going to make reality something that was clearly being crafted and developed over an extended period of time. And I think we can't just isolate any of the events, whether we're talking about antiquity or whether you're talking about modernity, as a lot of things are interconnected and act together in tandem. Like with the protests, we have to keep in mind that the coronavirus is going on, and also that we're in an economic depression where I think as of this week, another 14 million jobs were lost last month, according to the newest jobs report. And that might actually be not really 100%, as with all government sources and even just any media sources or people just like me. We all have our different biases, and I'm going to be upfront about mine, but a lot of people tend to try to make it seem like they're being objective, but in reality, they're just more so trying to use the cloak of objectivity to promote their own particular view on something while claiming it's objective, when if you actually analyze what they're saying and try to back that up with the empirical and factual reality on the ground, it's not usually the case. And it's very clear when you understand that a lot of these different peoples, like the host of news channels, like the corporate media, they're being paid, they're reading off a teleprompter, and they've been hired because of their particular view and style of presenting whatever the CNN approved narrative or a Fox News or MSNBC or CBS or any of these big corporations that really don't promote the best interest of regular people. They're more so indicative of the elites, the socialites, the modern day patricians, the wealthiest, the 1% that Bernie Sanders or other people always talk about. Whether you're on the left or right, I think most people can acknowledge and just look at the data where we see that the top 1%, the 1% are living lives. Like you see their houses and just their types of lifestyles, much like modern royalty. And I think that type of lifestyle, just like it was back then, as it is now, is very disconnected and creates a bubble where they might not, even if they have the best intentions, which most of them don't, I think, but a lot of them who even do, I think, are very much the victims of their own, circumstances, in the sense that when you are growing up in a certain context, especially if you're shielded by gobs and globs of cash, where if your family tried to spend all of it, they wouldn't really be able to. Someone like the Waltons or Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates family, which I know he donates some of his stuff to philanthropic things, but at the same time, keep in context that still he's very much technocratic. And if you look at how he acted when he was CEO of Microsoft, and you see the demeanor he gives off now, I'm not sure if many of you guys know this, but Bill Gates, the mugshot he actually had when he got arrested multiple times for driving without a license, actually became the silhouette default profile picture for Microsoft Windows Mail. And when it comes to just him as a person, he was definitely not someone who his current demeanor on the television is really indicative of. But he's a smart guy nonetheless. And I think that you could obviously take into account that he did predict 5 years ago that this virus was going on. And you can criticize some of his other activities. I wouldn't say he's the most altruistic figure, but at the same time, I think that we can also acknowledge certain realities about him and other people, which I think is indicative of our current established order when it comes to how the political system is structured. And this class of people that are mostly the wealthiest in New York, LA, or Silicon Valley, or whether it be Redmond, in Washington, all these like urban centers that are usually in their region, either the hub of their region or maybe even the hub of the country or the world more broadly. With New York, they're the financial capital of the United States, which makes them, as the number one economy, really the financial capital of the world ever since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 75 and 76. And when it comes to LA, for example, they are the media, the YouTube capital of the world, and the cultural clout that the United States projects, as much as I think we can criticize it, is still as a form of soft power, casting a huge shadow across the world. And same with the military. I think we are living in a period of decline, but we don't want to put the decline into absolutist terms or look at it from just the perspective. A lot of people like to look at the United States right now as being in sort of the late Republic period of the Roman Empire, when I would argue more so it's in the Byzantine, or I'd say from the transition of late antiquity to early Middle Ages, when Justin II and the successors of Justinian were in charge and things really started to collapse. And I think when it comes to the United States overall, we could learn, as I've said in another video, from the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. And Syria actually is one of their key provinces. And I think that Syria, as a country in the Middle East that has a rich history as a region, and also one that is filled with conflict, much like in ancient times with the Romans and the Persians. Whether you're talking about the early Roman Republic or the late Roman Republic, when Crassus had, during the Battle of Carrhae, with his son Publius, been killed in an attempt after they tried to invade the Parthian Empire. And then there was the obvious conflicts that extended for centuries after with the empire, even when it was from the heartlands of the Italian West. And then after, when it became Constantinople of New Rome, the later Byzantines and then the Sassanids, which had succeeded the Parthians in the 3rd century, would continue to fight in a way that's much reminiscent of the Cold War that we've been constantly in with Iran and Russia over that particular region. And the Soviets, along with just NATO as a whole, were constantly fighting over Eastern Europe, influence in Western Europe too, through the different political proxies and parties on the ground, and obviously in the Middle East as well. And I think that the same with having clients and proxy states with the United States, which I think the United States and Russia both have their own forms of that when it comes to having different minor players like Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all in their own ways based off of their geopolitical interest and their interest and interrelationships with these other countries. They have all created their own systems in which they're having loose alliances that are supposed to improve their own geopolitical settings and those of their benefactors, whether you're talking about Russia, America, China, or any of these other countries, at the expense, obviously, of their competitors. And that's just the nature of geopolitics. But when it comes to geopolitics, we really don't want to forget that on the ground, the political considerations and all these complicated bureaucratic affairs that we all seem to, if you're someone who's into this esoteric stuff, much of the time look at in theory and have the luxury of not having to receive the negative outcomes that are indicative of established orders such as the ones with the United States foreign policy and the Pentagon, and seeing the negative realities that are inflicted upon, those in Syria or other countries, that these innocent people are just like the innocent regular citizens in the United States or any other country. They're just trying to live their lives, and I think that the outcomes of these wars, as long as they can try to have a family, live their lives, and try to be happy, I think that that's all their concern is. And I think that most of this political back and forth thing is just not something that most regular people will ever find beneficial, and always causes these different types of either hot wars or cold wars where I think both sides are fighting for power that will only be held for such a limited amount of time. If you think about every empire, it rises and it falls. And I think that the pursuit of power, as tempting as it obviously is for many, and I think it's understandable why, has in a lot of ways historically led to the downfalls of otherwise talented, ambitious, and maybe even good-intentioned rulers at best. But at the moment, I think we have plenty of sociopaths in our government. And with this Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act of 2019 that was sponsored by Republican Angel Elliott of the New York 16th Congressional District, this is the asshole who recently talked about how he wasn't even really wanting to give a speech, but he only came out to his district because he was being primaried. And I hope the challenger who's primarying him takes that seat away. The Democrat in this type of area will always win, but so like with the general election, it'll be a foregone conclusion. But when it comes to this guy himself, this guy is a warmonger. He's a really shitty person, and he's just, I don't know, just the relic of obviously an old guard that really needs to go. And we can preserve positive traditions, but when it comes to Elliot Engel, the political tradition he hails from is clearly not equipped to deal with the times that we're in, and I think his obvious lack of empathy, and maybe just, maybe he said something, a joke like what he said, tongue-in-cheek, but regardless, I think that we don't need jokes right now. We need tangible solutions, and we need to stop having politicians that think they're either entertainers or people that are there for photo ops and to use the office as a form of self-aggrandizement. We need to have politicians that share the burdens of their constituents and are willing to hear out and pursue reforms that are oriented towards genuine consensus, and also make sure that we are taking care of our own, but at the same time not, stepping on people from thousands of miles away, which many people in the United States, if you tell them that we're in Syria right now, we have occupied a military base called Al-Tanf in the region of Syria that borders Iraq and Syria, and we are helping the local rebels there maintain a foothold, but we were never invited into this country. And if we believe in self-determination as a political concept and the idea of independence and political sovereignty, which we should, which this country is founded on, I think we need to start practicing what we preach, and we need to reconsider and reevaluate our current commitments abroad and start to potentially draw back and reorient things and the funding of such programs towards more productive measures, like having maybe the soldiers, instead of attacking protesters who are the ones who are peaceful. Obviously, if you're someone vandalizing or rioting, obviously that's a different story, but I think the National Guard's more appropriate for that. But with the military, maybe we can get them to be civil servants, much like the Roman legions were at their best times, when they would actually learn to construct bridges and build forts and actually repair the infrastructure, like allowing for the existence of the ancient postal service, which in the United States right now, there's even a debate whether or not the postal service will continue to exist, because we have a government of Democrats and Republicans who have allowed a situation in which it's gone bankrupt, and if it doesn't get the aid it needs, which we've given trillions of dollars at the discretion of the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, this eunuch-looking dude who is just an asshole and just a really bad person. I mean, he actually used to be the CEO of a company called One West Bank, where he from a mistake made from someone who sent a check, a 90-year-old grandmother, I think, someone who's really old, a senior citizen. He decided to not maybe email a request or mail her saying, hey, listen, you typed the wrong number in. How about you just correct that, send the money? I think she would have. It was $30 and she actually put 30 cents. Instead of doing that, he foreclosed on her and she got evicted. Like, that's really fucked up. And beyond all that, I think that just says a lot about him as a person, and the fact that he was not prosecuted by Kamala Harris, the Democrat, the Attorney General of California at the time, who's now the senator from California, who was trying to completely do a 180, which before she criticized Biden, and clearly she claimed she thought he was racist, but clearly she didn't think he was racist enough where she would deny the opportunity of being the vice president pick and maybe the de facto president if Biden keels over before his term is over, which is, I mean, possible. But I think that when it comes to how the Democrats really have enabled the corporate Dems, the worst in our society, to not face any consequences. But if anything, after he's done all these really awful things to people, he becomes the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He's the one in charge of the U.S. Treasury, our central bank, and all this other stuff. The Federal Reserve has to cooperate with which, although the Fed itself is a private institution, does have to collaborate with the Treasury Department when it comes to the circulation of our currency and how we conduct our economic policy. Why is this criminal in charge of the Treasury? That's ridiculous, and it's not only a joke, honestly. If you think about just how this has been allowed to happen, this is just unconscionable. But if you think about Obama and how he took a list from Citibank of different corporate board members to stack his administration with, and even the administrations of Bush and Clinton, we're all really talking about a system that has largely, maybe despite whoever the president is every 4 to 8 years, has really been just systemically rotten. And I think that when it comes to Elliot Engel, this guy, and along with a lot of the other Republicans, and Democrats, Pelosi, McConnell, we're dealing with some of the worst people, honestly, that should not be in charge, but unfortunately have been given the most power and authority. And I think that has something to also say about our broader society and how we have a really failed, not just infrastructure, but education system, just how we value and assess and appoint and pick people to perform the tasks that make society function. It's just very troubling. I think that not just with the Treasury Department, we could get into all these other things that are clearly not reflective of a positive reality, or one that has incentive structures to lead towards one. In fact, we have bad incentives that lead to bad outcomes and increasingly mediocre politicians. There are domestically mediocre and in some ways scary if you think about how they've recently decided to respond in such a way with the protests, which there has been some protests that have evolved in the rioting and looting, but a lot of that's just opportunists that would have done that. And regardless of what was going on, they would use a smokescreen. And it doesn't really surprise you when we have people in the government who are no better, who loot the Treasury, who are using the money that should be used to keep the post office funded, provide, a universal basic income, and also universal health care to everyone who's here in the country legally and has also been contributing into the economy, whether you're talking about citizens, international students, other people, just in general. If you're here paying into the system during a time of emergency should be able to provide basic necessities and ensure that people aren't going to face this eviction crisis, which very soon, if something doesn't change, is going to happen. And we're just in a situation right now that, with just like the pandemic response, was really just not one that was determined by like the nature of our system because of how all right it was, but because of how bad things have been, how much we should have sooner started to change and reorient and reform. And we could debate on the nature of the reform, but if you're not even willing to accept that this status quo is clearly not working, I mean, at this point, you're fucking useless. And I mean, and it's just kind of sad because like this is our society right now that we're in, and you can laugh at it sometimes, but I think that it says more about us ourselves as those who can even afford to live and not have to deal with the consequences of these actions. I think that if that anything else makes us more accountable and should empower us more to use our time to actually come up with solutions, and more than just on YouTube, obviously, have debate or talk about the culture war or go over what like mediocre issue that happened, who did what, or just all this childish kind of high school shit that like really should have been something we all aged out of. But clearly there's people in the government in their 60s and 70s that are acting no better than entitled kids who don't appreciate anything. And I think that they take for granted their positions of authority and the level of power that needs to be used responsibly, especially for a country like the United States. It's just, it calls into question everything that the foundations of the society. But I think that if we're going to rebuild, if we're going to recover, we need to be aware of all these particular problems and be willing to accept and own up to the history of them, but not obviously have an irrational self-hatred. We need to, in fact, learn and become better, not just for the other people around us, but for ourselves, and try to be the best versions of ourselves that we can possibly be. Making mistakes, saying things that you no longer believe in. I mean, everyone has gotten to a point where we can accept that as adults, no one's perfect. Everyone has flaws. As humans, we all live and learn. And I think that we all live and learn at different levels and at different capacities, depending on your age, experience, all of the different things that are mostly deterministic, that you don't choose where you're born, what country you're from, what language you speak. You can do, though, once you're able to be conscious enough of these factors and maybe have the self-awareness to be introspective, look at yourself, and also analyze your individual position in the broader context of society. Some people don't have that ability, and I mean, if you don't, or if you're interested in other stuff, that's your choice. And I mean, do what really makes you happy, and if what makes you happy is politics, be involved with that stuff. Politics, the idea of the original origin of what an idiot was way back when was rooted in ancient Athens, where idiots were the people who had no interest in politics. And the reason why Athens had that definition was that at the time, Athens was a radical self-governing city-state from Greece, in which it wasn't like it controlled all of Greece, but it did at one point, I mean, a lot of Greece, under the Delian League after the wars against Persia. But Athens gained its supremacy because of the political doctrine of its time, where it allowed all of its citizens to vote and have direct democracy, an assembly of people where they were able to together adjudicate and create the political matters that defined the context of their society. And that it was those principles, those ideas that in a lot of ways the Romans and later us as people who are in the West, those are the things that really define and give the identity of the broader West. And I think that the West has had a problem historically from some time, and like any other countries in the world, I think, of acknowledging the mistakes that still should be things that we should be conscious of and learn from, but obviously be aware of and not be in denial of. I mean, we can't just pretend like certain historic realities are not the case. We can't really just, I think if anything, the problem of why we're here right now is we've created a system that breeds ignorance and also like more of a, soundbite driven pop culture in which we try to chase for dopamine and also just, the affirmation from others, when in reality we are engaging in topics that really have very little significance. And in the grand scheme of things, when we look at the sad reality that numbers and statistics are the remnants that encapsulate, whether we're talking about the coronavirus casualties or the ultimate verdict of history, whether we're talking about us, the Romans, or anything like that, we boil down their outcomes to empirical data and forget that these are the people just like us who had their own lives, considerations, their own achievements, their own follies. And I think that we need to understand that in the broader context, the system itself is what needs to reform. And we as individuals need to acknowledge that we're part of a broader community in this, and that we can't have a self-interested mentality of just being a pure individualist. I think if anything, these politicians left and right are super indicative of that, and are just, we are seeing right now in this particular order that I'll talk about now, this act, that it's just not good. And I think of all the different things I could talk about, as I've gone on a tirade, I think we can understand that it would be more beneficial for you guys, just like I have, to read the individual things that have been, listed here that will be legally binding yourself. And I'll link it in the description below, the official bill that was public on the congressional government website, which don't take my word for anything. Do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. Don't settle for other people telling you how to think. Think for yourself. And I think that that's something we all should be doing. And we can listen to other people, accept feedback, take criticism, hear new ideas, challenge ourselves. But at the same time, obviously, keep in mind that everyone has a bias. Person, politician, publication, polity, the state. This is all just, people govern states, and states are the things that people exist within when it comes to the social contract and the social context that we're in. And we can acknowledge and realize and accept these realities, the positives and the negatives, or we could just be willfully, if we're intelligent enough, ignorant, or at best, just for the people who are just, for whatever reason, stupid. We just have to acknowledge there are some stupid people also. Just got to go out on a regular basis. It's not really hard to spot a stupid person. And to a degree, we're all, when it comes to different things, stupid. I think in general, another problem overall is how we value our intelligence and what we consider intelligent and stupid. I think that we've made profitable plenty of different industries and different endeavors that really should not be incentivized. And if we only evaluate our economy off of the gross domestic product, or the GDP, or how the stock market, the Nasdaq or the Dow Jones is doing, which really is not entirely connected to the realities of those who are not wealthy enough to have been able to participate in that particular patronage system. And those people, their considerations should still matter. And I think that that goes for all Americans and all people. And at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that we can't tell other countries how to govern themselves. We're barely able to have this country really be cohesive, and I think we need to still work on that greatly when it comes to the social fabric of our society. But be that as it may, I think if you look for particular of this one issue with the this bill with Syria, which naming it after Julius Caesar, this guy, I think that that's just kind of funny in and of itself. It's kind of ironic, postmodern, if you ask me. But this particular mandate over here just goes to show that, of all the other stuff that you'll definitely be able to read about, that you can have seen on the screen from the last couple of minutes I've been speaking, really encapsulates that this is a very disingenuous bill, which really is just like with the Patriot Act, which took away much of the Fourth Amendment, and the different sorts of shadow banning and censorship and deprioritization, and having algorithms that prioritize corporations over independent media on YouTube and other sites. I think that it's very obvious that things that are supposedly our rights are not necessarily guaranteed. The checks and balances are contingent on our own ability to, have the republic and keep it, as Ben Franklin once said. And I think when it comes to this particular is just very, very troubling. Because this bill, honestly, it claims to be protecting Syrian civilians, but it really isn't. And it gives it away. If you actually read the bill, which a lot of people won't read the bill, that's why I'm going to include it in the description, the entirety of it. I could go on about this entire bill, but it would take a long time to do it justice. We all have to be able to be our own fact checkers, read and make sense of things, and use a little bit of common sense. Obviously, don't be schizophrenic and just a paranoid person who just has clearly maybe just been too partisan for their own good. And obviously, that's easy to get into that mentality. Our society encourages it. I don't blame individuals. I blame institutions and how incentive structures are created. And that we need to start realizing those realities and changing those incentive structures for the better so that we can all prosper. But for example, is a sanction, and this is how these sanctions work. As the United States is the dominant geopolitical power, both economically and militarily, at the moment, we're still living at the end of a period in which America exists as a unipolar force, in which it can impose its will through soft power and other means beyond just the military that are just as effective and just as deadly and damaging. And then that's about with these sanctions, because what these sanctions are clearly also doing beyond just the reality that for decades now, Assad's family, along with many families and people that create, we could call them autocratic states, but are still, as with any country that's, the United States, Russia, China, all these different countries, whether you're talking about one political ideology or another, if it's governing and in power, the mask it wears, I think, is very thin when it comes to understanding that the nature of power is universal in terms of how it is wielded and how it works when it comes to these different political states, because they're all being governed by humans and we all have different culture and obviously origins, whether we're talking about ethnicity, race, or religion, or any of these other factors, which obviously have importance. But power itself is something that is universally understood. It's a part of our biological programming when it comes to how we organize and structure societies. And when you understand that these sanctions are not really effective in the sense that the Assad family has been able to, like many others, establish a state that had the ability to maintain its own independence and sovereignty, in the sense that you don't have to agree with what they're doing. And I think that there's criticisms that you can definitely have towards any government, but when it comes to it not being within the United States' geopolitical orbit, which with the United States, we're very much interested in areas like Syria that have geostrategic importance. We want to, like any other geopolitical empire, much like Athens wanted to dominate the Aegean, the United States wants to dominate Europe, Asia, Africa, and all the affairs that are going on there in a political sense. And I think that that's just something that is very obvious based off of the actions of, if you look at our foreign policy and what politicians will even say themselves. They'll frame it maybe in a different way, but that's just how they're participating in the geopolitical games that have been a common trait of all the biggest great powers. And some of these great powers have learned firsthand the consequence of losing in this great game, or I mean, not to reference the war that the British had with the insurgents in Afghanistan, much like the United States had, which was also a war between the British and the Russians, which was called the Great Game, which was much like a Cold War when it comes to how we, the United States ourselves, after 1991, had a Cold War with the Soviet Union, which its successor state today is the Russian Federation. And they are, under Vladimir Putin, the Assad family, along with Iran, but mostly I think even more than Iran, with Russia, they were the key benefactor and insurance policy that Assad was able to muster up in 2015 that saved his family and the rest of the Alawites, which are the political leaders of the Syrian government, despite being only about 10% in population. They've been able to retake from the different militant groups, whether we're talking about the Free Syrian Army, the al-Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which was recently rebranded, I think, to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but it's basically ISIS with better public relations. They're pretty, Islamist. And there's a lot of evidence in the Free Syrian Army that there was moderate so-called rebels that the Obama administration, and then later with the Trump administration, they would, under the Pentagon and these different groups like the CIA, would fund these different groups, which themselves were either fighting each other or were engaged in activities that really were not that great. I mean, you could criticize the Assad government, but as a secular government that was practicing independence and mostly involved within its own region and affairs, I think the United States should not be involved, and I think we should withdraw our troops from Syria and at the same time respect the sovereignty of not just Syria, but every other country, and build mutually beneficial relationships fostered on genuine friendship and collaboration based off of things that we could all benefit from, whether we're talking about economically, socially. I think that we could have a situation like that. And we don't have to agree with everything Assad does, but we should respect that Bashar al-Assad, clearly, despite Obama and the Saudi foreign minister at the time, who I think both are no longer in power. Maybe the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia is. They are a despotic Salafi kingdom that's pretty much run by a vassal client king of the United States, Mohammed bin Salman, and not him, I think his father right now, and then he's the crown prince. He's basically the de facto king. His father's pretty geriatric and probably has the mental capacity of Donald Trump or Joe Biden. But I mean, listen, that's just the system that we're dealing with, and we're backing people like Saudi Arabia, countries like Israel, which those, and the Gulf states that like the UAE, they're the ones who primarily benefit, and Turkey, I guess, too, to an extent, since they have the rebels that they're backing in northern Idlib. They are the real beneficiaries, along with the United States, when it comes to our goal. I mean, and this is, I think it's beneficiary towards the Hawks, who its goal is to overthrow Assad, this sort of deal. And it just goes to show when you're going to penalize not just the government there, but obviously since the government themselves has figured out alternative channels to making money, they might suffer a lot themselves and deal with political instability. But they have consolidated and established a system which has been so resilient that it was able to be spared the similar fates of other countries that during the Arab Spring in 2011, like Tunisia, like Egypt under now al-Sisi, who overthrew, I think, Hosni Mubarak and these other guys, and all these other countries like Libya, which is in a civil war, which I talked about recently. Video will be included also here. it's very, very much telling that we are now at a point where this country that was at the very brink of almost collapsing. I mean, at one point, the Islamic State was besieging Damascus in 2012, 2013. The fact that Assad was able to consolidate this power and control means that his preservation, whether it was due primarily to the Iranian-backed militias such as Hezbollah and the leadership of under the former general who was assassinated by Trump and the Trump administration, Qasem Soleimani, or where they're talking about Russia with the Air Force that pretty much ensured that Aleppo, the siege was pretty much going to be a victory for Assad, and then afterwards he was able to consolidate and retake most of the country. I think all this country where the population centers are. Because much like Libya, if you look at Syria on a map, the size of the country is not indicative necessarily of where all the population is living. The population lives mostly towards the Mediterranean, and Damascus itself, despite not being a Mediterranean city, is still closer enough to that area and is also the key to historically having the geopolitical control over the region itself. And Damascus itself, under Assad, who resides in his presidential palace there, had been able to successfully regain the control and ensure the preservation of all the major cities in Syria, such as Homs, Latakia, Hama, Aleppo. And with those cities, there's about 60-70% of the entire population that's left. But the reality is the country has suffered tremendously. The war has destroyed Aleppo, which was the Paris, I think, of the Middle East at one point, and one of the most important cities in the former Ottoman Empire. And that used to be the number one population center, and now Damascus is, as most of the country that still stayed had fled to that city. The remainder of the country, though, for the most part, has been greatly destroyed. And if you understand that, that segues this into E in the sense that they're going to need outside foreign aid, whether you're talking about from the United Nations or whether you're talking about all these different, I'm not saying the United Nations would do this right now, but if they were theoretically the humanitarian organization that they claim to be as outlined in their charter, and all these other countries, if we were truly trying to represent the best interest of the people there, we wouldn't, I don't even say use tax money, but we could have private companies or other groups of people that would help and co-sponsor the helping of rebuilding. But obviously we're not welcome there. The United States, along with all the people, such as the British, other countries, French, and other Gulf states and countries that pretty much were responsible, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, for this war and how the outcome was. I think the rebels were greatly aided and empowered by all these different groups I've just mentioned, including the United States, unfortunately. And it was only fortunate enough because that these different administrations, whether you're talking about Obama or Trump, whom had a more coherent than not foreign policy, if you look at the differences in the Middle East, there's been, with Trump, obviously the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was a little bit exceptional, but other than that, there has been a certain degree of caution. But at the same time, there's been missile strikes and the covert funding of different proxy groups, and clearly, obviously, I think an overcommitment when we have crumbling infrastructure and millions of Americans underinsured, and we have an economic crisis right now in which we're still prioritizing passing legislation involving a country thousands of miles away where most of the people in this country probably wouldn't even be able to figure where it was out on a map. I mean, what are we doing? I think that this is something that is not a bug, it's a feature of a bad system that we need to reform. And if you understand E, knowing directly or indirectly provides a significant construction or engineering service to the government of Syria. Well, I mean, obviously this country is not this libertarian country where the private companies themselves, where would they even have the resources? Most of these things, there's a whole dispute going on between Assad and his cousin right now, which I talked about in another video, Rami Makhlouf, who controlled 60 or 70% of the entire Syrian economy and was a telecom oligarch. And if you understand, I mean, even then, the country's doesn't really have that much resources compared to some country like the United States, or even a country that's losing a lot of its prestige like the United Kingdom or even France. I mean, when it comes to their ability to project power, maybe France will be able to hold on through its neo-colonial ambitions with Africa, but the British, every day, it seems like they're going to become the United Kingdom of England and Wales soon, and maybe just England, maybe they'll break up too, who knows? I mean, honestly, at this point, many people, who cares? But when it comes to, I care, and I understand the British people care, but I think at the same time, the sense that, considering Britain's former preeminence and now their current state of affairs, which I think the United States should learn from, just as much as we should learn from countries like the ancient city-states of Greece or Rome or Byzantium. I think that there's a lot of lessons that we're not showing that we've been able to learn from. And at the end of the day, regular people, whether you're talking about Britain, whether you're talking about the Romans, or even the Americans here, are going to suffer. And I think that not only us at this point, we're showing with this legislation, regular people are going to suffer, because if the United States is going to threaten to sanction any foreign persons or country that tries to involve itself with construction and engineering services to the government of Syria, it's of course going to be the government of Syria that was going to be in charge of rebuilding the country after it was destroyed during this war. And the infrastructure, whether you like the current government of Syria or not, they're going to be in charge of the infrastructure rebuilding. These different people can come out and claim that the Free Syrian Army is going to do something that's not going to be possible, or that there's moderate rebels that are somehow secular and not like saying that they're going to ethnically cleanse the Christians or the Shia minority, or behead children, which you can see that they've been doing. I think that we need to accept that the Assad government's there to stay. And ironically, Obama said that when his days was numbered, Assad. I mean, the reality was Obama's days politically were more numbered than his. And not only that, but like I think the arrogance of our U.S. foreign policy right now is not only bad for us, but it's devastating now for Syria, as I think 80% of the country lives below the poverty line. And when it comes to this crisis, which in Lebanon, their banking crisis has trickled over, just like as many countries are interconnected, especially Syria, and their financial well-being was buoyed a lot during the war because of its assets that were in Lebanon or Beirut. With the instability in Lebanon, which I'll talk about in another video, there is so many things that are just compounding together. And the U.S., instead of trying to actually help the Syrian people, much like the Friends of Syria group, which was instead of this misleading, 1984 name like the Patriot Act or the War on Terror, I think that these legislation like the Friends of Syria are not really being friends, or it's not really helping the civilians. It's more so just a doublespeak way of trying to mask altruism, or mask self-interest as altruism. And I think it's very clear. And when it comes to Syria in particular, this is going to prevent a lot of otherwise interested countries in themselves participating in mutually beneficial transactions, such as the ones that we claim that as free market people, I think in the United States tend to claim, are in favor of. I mean, we're limiting their free market in the sense that they're not able to collaborate with countries that might otherwise be willing to work with them if they have to risk the United States' economic sanctions and wrath, which they don't just hurt the government. And in this case, they might not even hurt the government enough to topple it. They're just going to cause the cost of living in Syria to be unlivable, and might cause starvation and lack of resources and basic necessities, especially during this global pandemic where they were already facing with their medical infrastructure a crisis. We're adding fuel to a fire that we should not be doing. And I think that we need to all be introspective, not only at ourselves, but also especially at how we've allowed the government to pass legislation like this, which is not really at all productive. And in fact, I think very detrimental, not just to us, but the people of Syria, which I've met many Syrians, and maybe it's anecdotal, but they come off as pretty great people. And I think that we should honestly try to focus on rebuilding our own country and focusing on, improving ourselves, and not just, be out abroad and try to dictate to other countries how their political structures are going to be ordered when our own house is in order. Those in glass houses should not be throwing stones, and we need to start fixing our house. Because if you look at Michigan, like I talked about in another video, it's very much endemic and a microcosm, much like the U.S. election is, of our situation right now. And I definitely recommend you check out this particular bill that I will include in the description below. I was going to read an article about will the more serious sanctions hurt the very civilians they aim to protect, by Basma Alouche and Alex Simon, which was published a few days ago on warontherocks.com. But honestly, I think that you guys should just read it for yourself, just like the legislation. Let me know what you think. If you agree, disagree, comment below. But I'm really seeking a serious conversation about the reality of these sanctions. We can always try to debate and have interesting, sidetracked conversations about theoretical, maybe interesting content that'll give you a dopamine rush. But when it comes to the sorts of legislation that really define our foreign policy, that in the international community, this community of nations we always tend to claim to be the leader of, this is very much indicative of a very much flawed and very corrupt and brutal system, and a foreign policy that's not really either America first or even concerned with humanity first. This is more just a sort of thing that enables the military-industrial complex and also the worst elements of our society at the expense of innocent people from around the world, I think, who might otherwise be sympathetic to the United States and actually want to be friends. I think that this is something that long-term is not going to amount to positive outcomes. And I hope that eventually this legislation will be vetoed. I would be delusional to tell you guys that Joe Biden or the Democrats, which are basically going to sign off on this as well, because they fundamentally do agree on this subject, much like the Republicans under McConnell do. I mean, we're talking about two wings of the same bird when it comes to politics, and I think that we need to start realizing certain realities and also being more critically analyzing these events and be pursuing the most accurate interpretation, reading the legislation itself, which I still need to finish, but I've read halfway through, and I've read enough to see deeply troubling things beyond just that letter E. And I definitely recommend you read this article that I will attach in the description below, and just let me know what you think and keep up with the situation, as despite what some people might think, the United States is intimately involved with our foreign policy, and we have a military base in the border of Iraq and Syria called al-Tanf. Look it up. If you don't take my word for any of this, do your own research, think for yourself, and take the initiative to understand that there are broader events that are shaping not just what goes on abroad, but obviously how reactions to domestic policy are. If you understand that the police officers who are trained at these academies are being trained using by contractors from the Israeli Defense Force, which itself acts like a hostile military foreign occupying force in the West Bank, which right now I need to talk about in future videos. A lot of momentous stuff is going on, but when it comes to that, no person on the ground, regular person, whether they talk about Palestinian or regular Jewish person, benefits from that. Like the United States, no one benefits right now in the United States from, unless you're a part of this handful of oligarchs that have a profit to gain from creating weapons of destruction and sending our own troops to die for causes that really are not productive for the United States. If you're a part of those groups, fuck you guys, honestly. But anyway, I think that if you're not in that group, which most people aren't, we should all be willing to keep up with this and try to figure out as best as we can ways to have more positive reforms and outcomes when it comes to how we orient not just our domestic policy, but our foreign policy as well. Maybe I'm wrong, though. Let me know what you think. I look forward to hearing what everyone says, and make sure to check out this article along with the official legislation that is H.R. 31, the Syrian Caesar Civilian Protection Act, which is a funny name for multiple reasons, and hopefully after watching this, you understand that sentiment at least, whether you agree with it or not, and understand how much of a 1984 dystopian sort of legislation that's more endemic to the system itself, and just be aware, and try to do all of our part. I mean, try to do your part, I'll try to do my part, in our most humble way of being able to increase the awareness and have more complicated conversations that raise the standards and raise the bar of discourse and doesn't just have it degenerate into meaningless arguments about really things that don't matter, that in reality, in a society that was functioning healthily, would be in that list of shit no one should give care about. But unfortunately, if anything, the opposite is true, and we are in a situation that's going to be talked about more myself in future content. If you agree, disagree, let me know. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe over at youtube.com/getnuanced, and let me know what you think also on Twitter. My Twitter is @TJC. The show's is @getnuanced. Thanks, and I'll catch you all in the next video I make real soon. For now, peace out.